following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. Hello, listeners around the world on radio, streaming, and podcast services. This is It's Not Therapy. I'm Liana Kersner, and I am not a therapist, but I am your source for practical advice for everyday problems, using my top 10 sayings for checking in with your best self. This week, we're talking about the language used to talk about mental health, the metaphors, terminology, and vocabulary we use to talk about deeply personal things. I've got a great guest coming up later, Phil Stark, a therapist and screenwriter for TV and film, including shows you've probably seen, South Park, That 70s Show. He also did the script for the film Dude, Where's My Car? Phil will be here to talk metaphors in mental health. But first, as usual, I set the table based on conversations I've had with people just like you this week. If you want to ask a question, leave a comment, or make a suggestion about anything you hear on this show, go to nottherapyshow.com, fill out the contact form, join our mailing list, or if you want to email me directly, Liana@nottherapyshow.com, or Twitter, Instagram, @nottherapyshow. And if you hear some strange noises on this episode, my cat Scout is being extra active, so that is not your imagination, and that is not a technical glitch. That is a cat. Nature's glitch. Right, Scout? Yeah. Now, I get asked a lot what a peer counselor does, even when I'm not, still nursing a cough. And when I'm less sick, I have a really cheeky answer to what does a peer counselor do? Well, I do two things. I talk to people, but more importantly, I listen to people. Top 10 phrase, listen twice before you talk once. Now, this week, I was in a session with a client, and I felt like I was entering some really sensitive territory. So I said to him, as a preamble, I'm going to ask you some really basic questions that I think I already know the answers to, but I want to be sure. So me sounding stupid is going to be a feature, not a bug. And he laughed. I know I'm in the right spot when a client laughs, especially during sensitive subjects. But that it's a feature, not a bug, is a term you usually hear in design circles, frequently in software design. Now, my client understood that reference, but earlier I'd used the term, it's very inside baseball, and I had to explain that one to him. And this is the thing about metaphors. Metaphors are really effective. They're powerful if both parties understand them and understand them in the same way. If both people don't have the same understanding of a metaphor, it can be a train wreck, right? The psychologist Carl Jung attempted to create a universalized set of metaphors to understand the self. And this is where we get concepts like persona, the shadow, anima and animus. And so much of that has gone horribly wrong in modern context because some people treat Jung as this unchanging gospel instead of a framework to adapt as needed. Now, Jung, on top of those four parts of the self, those four bits, metaphors, he came up with 12 personality archetypes. Now, this basic concept has since been expanded by personality typing systems like the Myers-Briggs system to 16 personality types. Again, these things are very helpful if used as a tool for understanding. The problem is when these classifications become prescriptive, when businesses decide some personality types are good and some personality types are bad. Basic retail jobs are asking for Myers-Briggs types on applications now. Why? I have no idea. This approach cuts both personnel and companies off from opportunities and solutions, instead of broadening the horizons to see other ways of doing things. And that's the exact opposite to what these systems were designed to do. Now, full disclosure, I'm the rarest Myers-Briggs personality type out there. an INFJ bordering on an INTJ. So perhaps I have a vested interest in a system that suggests I'm just doing things differently instead of doing things wrong. But that's why I disclose this. Bias declared. Now, pop culture, on the other hand, getting less technical, is a great source of shared metaphors. We refer to personal weak points as our kryptonite. We refer to manipulations as Jedi mind tricks. And when we think something is probably going to suck, we might say, winter is coming. And I maintain there are two types of people in this world. Those who know about the hot dog dimension from Everything Everywhere All at Once, and those who don't. If you haven't seen that movie, see that movie. It's amazing. But of course, there's my absolute favorite metaphor reference. The Darmok episode of Star Trek The Next Generation. Darmok and Jalad Tanagra? Yeah, where Picard has to communicate with a man on another planet who speaks completely in metaphors that Picard doesn't understand. Now, I like that one because it's a metaphor about metaphors. It's a meta-metaphor. And if you don't watch Star Trek The Next Generation, the last 30 seconds have meant nothing to you. It's in this soup of hazelnut spread of meaning. That was a metaphor. Nutella. It's easy to lose sight of the fact that all these meaning sounds are just commonly understood symbols. No matter what lexicon we use, these are all just sounds and pictures that we've agreed, mostly, have certain commonly shared meanings. Again, metaphors can be really inspiring. They can help get us into a better headspace. But it's also very possible to take metaphors too far and start treating them as more important than people. And I'm going to take a point of privilege and do a little Pride Month content right now. Here we go. Happy Pride. This taking metaphors too far and treating them as more important than people. We see this in the extremely bitter fight over gender-affirming medicine. Now, at the core of this fight is the central question of what makes a person. Is the definition of a person found in their body or in their mind? Now, the anti-trans side insists that transgender people are mentally ill and that their minds need to be corrected. The pro-trans side says that their minds are just fine, thanks. They were just born in the wrong body. And then to complicate this even further, you've got a spectrum of people, the gender fluid people, the non-binary people, gender apathetic people like me. That's apparently a thing, gender apathy. Who knew? But all these people don't necessarily require medical services. This is just a group of people who chafe against what gender means. Hairstyles, clothing, ways of sitting, standing, speaking. As a culture, we've assigned an exhausting amount of gendered meanings to these things. If one more person suggests I need to be more ladylike. Now, to the average person, you listening out here, minding your own business, this can seem like a whole lot of sound and fury signifying nothing, to borrow from Shakespeare. And that's where the culture war begins. Activists on both sides try to convince people to care, mostly by trying to appeal to people's fear, shame, disgust, and anger, because those are the easiest emotional buttons to push. Now, those on the anti-trans side are actually changing the definition of words to push these emotional buttons. They refer to surgeries as mutilation. They've successfully tilted the meaning of grooming children away from luring them into sexual molestation to teaching kids that gay and trans people exist. Bills in the United States have been passed based on a definition of this term that didn't exist, I'll be very generous and say 5 years ago. Now, of course, the anti-trans activists insist that trans people didn't exist until the term trans existed. Now, the term transgender was coined in 1971, but transgender was shortened to trans somewhere around 1996. And that's where the whole gender ideology thing comes from. And, oh, this didn't exist before the mid-90s. It's not true. It's so not true. I don't have time to get into how not true it is. Because they're trying to claim a phenomenon didn't exist until there was a modern word for it. And these are many of the same people who try to claim both that gay people didn't exist before the concept of sexual orientation, somewhere in, the 1950s or 60s, but they also try to claim the Bible prohibits this thing they claim didn't exist in biblical times. This doesn't make any sense on its face, but the arguments are working. And they work for a very simple reason. Because these arguments are tailored to the reality that people who experience the world through the immediate basics of the five senses far outnumber the people like me who interpret the world through meanings or patterns. So it's easier to convince the majority to define gender based on body parts because they see it. It's right there. Confirm. Don't go around asking to see certain body parts. Just, I gotta be careful these days, right? But that's basic. That's easy. Defining it by what a person's brain is expecting their body parts to be, that involves patterns. That involves connections. That is the natural state of thinking for a minority of the population. So it's a harder sell, even though modern science is increasingly showing that gender identity originating in the brain is very real. And more importantly, you can't train a person out of it. And this is where metaphors become extremely important to the issue of trans people and trans medicine, trans affirming care. Akila, one of my bubblehead facilitators, you've heard her on the show before, she's trans. And she uses the metaphor of a car taking a particular type of fuel. Her brain needs woman fuel, that means estrogen, to run properly. Now, is Akila literally a car? No. Does the comparison help explain her situation in tangible terms for people? Yes. That's how metaphors work to foster communication. And so they can be powerful tools to increase happiness, or they can be used to deceive and manipulate. So how does a therapist use them in their practice? I'm going to talk to, Phil Stark, therapist and Hollywood screenwriter, comedy screenwriter, about his use of metaphors in his practice after the break. It's going to be great. It's going to be so good. If anything here inspires a question, comment, or suggestion, again, you can email me at Liana@NotTherapyShow. Too much to remember, go to nottherapyshow.com, fill out the contact form, and join the mailing list, or Instagram, Twitter, Not Therapy Show. We'll be back with Phil Stark after this break. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back on It's Not Therapy. I'm still Liana Kersner. I'm still not a therapist. We're still talking metaphors and mental health. And it's time for the It's Not Therapy interview. Phil Stark, he's an associate marriage and family therapist in Los Angeles, but he's also an author and a screenwriter. And I'm like, you wrote the first season of South Park, and he's done more than that, but that has an emotional attachment to me. So yeah, South Park, That 70s Show, and the film Dude, Where's My Car? And Phil Stark's here to talk to us on It's Not Therapy about metaphor. Phil, thanks so much for giving us your time here. As you can tell, I love your work.
My pleasure, and always nice to hear.
Yeah, so you're a similar comedy and then the mental health space, and you write these wonderful, like extended parables on Psychology Today about little slice of life stuff, but they're all about concepts. And that's a risk in that format. The thing I like about it is it feels vulnerable. You're willing to be kind of goofy and have people not get it, to really have other people get it and connect to it. So why did you decide to take that approach to the mental health writing?
Well, when I transitioned from screenwriting into therapy, I I had always in the back of my mind thought I would still write, but I didn't know what I would write. I figured I would write a book, but I didn't know what it was. As I found myself getting into the work of being a therapist, I would often, find myself saying to a client, being depressed is sort of like, it's like being in quicksand. It's like if you struggle, you're going to sink. And the hardest thing to do is to lay flat and you float. And just I think as an instinct of the creative process is always comparing one thing and translating it through another metaphor. So I started jotting those down. I realized this could be my thing. And it's something that now that I see that I do it all the time with clients in the session. And I'm constantly jotting ideas down. Oh, it's like this. And sometimes a client will say, you know what, it's sort of like this. And I'm like, oh, yeah, that's great. And I think what I hear you saying that I appreciate is the tone of the pieces. And I really, screenwriting, you're writing scripts, you have a bit of a voice, but you really have characters in between yourself and the reader. So doing it like this, I really feel like I'm talking to the reader. And by doing it like that, I like to think that I'm allowing my own tone and personality and point of view to really come across.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's also like the hamster one about the hamster that you love the hamster. And all of a sudden, the hamster started biting when you stuck. And I had the same thing happen with a hamster my sister had back in the day. And so it's immediately relatable. And I thought I knew where you were going with it, but it was so rewarding and validating to kind of go, okay, the moral of the story is, it was almost like a modern Aesop's fable. But that's exactly what Aesop's fable were, right? It was stories about animals meant to make a point.
Well, you say parable, which is great. In the book, Dude, Where's My Catharsis? A friendly and engaging guide to talk therapy. It's a collection of, at first it was going to be about metaphors and similes and parables and all the figures of speech. But then I realized that gets a little confusing. But your point being taken is that some of them are parables, which are essentially extended metaphors telling a story that at the end makes you realize this is how this applies to what we're actually talking about in real life. It's not about a tortoise and a hare. It's about how sometimes if you're going slow and steady, you can do better than if you just rush ahead. And so a lot of these are essentially parables, but they're designed so at the end you read it and you're like, oh, I see how that applies to something in my life that I had never really thought about that way. And now I understand it better.
Yeah. Now, I mean, a huge barrier to the effectiveness of therapy is not just access. It's a language thing. At least I found that therapy is written for a very specific type of person. Like I read the CBT guides and you can practically see the suburban white lady in LA, with the little shrine in the background and the yoga mat and everything like that. The languages, and I don't think that's intentional. That's just the way it went. And we know that men are less likely to seek therapy. When they do, it's a harder process for them. Have you found the language barrier in your own work, and have you found that the metaphors help with that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm trying to think of an example, but like you mentioned CBT, and there's a lot of language there about thoughts and definitions of thoughts and restraining thoughts and restricting thoughts. And there's clinical terms that are developed, and you can share that with a client, but it's sort of like teaching them a new language. But if you simply say, like if we were talking about meditation, which is another approach to anxiety in the similar way that CBT handles, and you just said something like, imagine if you're just sitting there and you realize that this whole time the clock on your wall has been ticking, but you never heard it. But if you're sort of quiet and don't think about it, you hear this ticking clock. And you realize that that's everything else beyond the ticking clock is noise and the type of things that cause us anxiety. So a metaphor like that maybe helps somebody realize that, I have power over my thoughts, and there's a baseline at which I can be at peace. And it's less about using the language of a particular modality and just trying to find an example that helps a client understand a concept in their own language.
Yeah. I mean, do you find with, because you do a lot of couples therapy as well, that common language is, I mean, the thing in that, right? People can say things, it's the same word, it means completely different things to two different people. Do you find that changing the language used actually helps uncover that?
Yeah, in fact, I had a session with a client recently, and he's an artistic guy, and he works in the arts and the creative fields, and he was having a hard time. He kept saying things like, "I want to be doing this, but I should be doing this," and you know what, this is what I want, but I should be doing this. We started talking about should, and not only would he help define should in his mind, but there were different kinds of shoulds. There was the should where like, hey, I should be approaching this in a way that's going to help my reader understand it, versus, hey, I should be doing something quote unquote constructive right now. So we even talked about the different kinds of shoulds in that aspect. So a lot of my work is examining the difference between what we say and what we mean. And we can easily get caught up in a word like should and have everybody accept that, oh, I know what that means. But it's worth examining a little deeper in session about, okay, what do we really mean? Let's use different words. Let's dig into that a little.
Yeah, yeah. It's also, I mean, should has such a value judgment on it, right? It's one of those really charged words that every time they come out of my mouth, I'm like, do I really mean should? Yeah. Do I really mean that? Because that's a big word. Do you find as well that especially with new clients, the whole language of disorder, and I mean, disorder is another big word. But then you have things like anxiety and depression. And anxiety and depression are such big catch-all terminologies. They are practically meaningless. I've done things where AI art is used for a client to say, this is what my anxiety looks like. This is what my depression looks like. And for one client, it can be like a swarm of butterflies. Another, it's a man standing in the doorway. Another, it's a big fantasy demon. And obviously those are very different states, right? The idea of a big bad or some foreboding presence as opposed to being mobbed by something, just being consumed. And have you found that as well? Have you found that letting the client set the vocabulary actually increases precision?
Yeah, I mean, you know, oftentimes a client will come to me and be like, you know, I'm really experiencing depression, or I'm feeling a lot of anxiety, which is, you know, totally normal. They have feelings, and especially with the way that mental health is becoming more accepted and popular in our society, people see that in newspaper articles. They read about it in the New York Times, postpartum depression, work-related anxiety. But part of my job, I think, is to say, okay, well, tell me about that. Just get really curious. And they might come up with their own image for what it feels like, or what is causing it in a way that's very different from another person experiencing anxiety. So I think you're right. Like, there's no one size fits all version of anxiety, depression. Those are the two, I think, the biggest encompass almost everything that I work with. But it's really about getting into the specific experience of that person in the room with you or on the screen with you, and finding out what it means to them.
And I mean, we've locked people into what something is supposed to. Supposed to is another clobber term, right? With depression, oh, it means you're sad. But for some people, it can manifest into anger. And I'm sure we've both worked with people in entertainment where their depression, their anxiety was manifesting as anger because they thought they had to be the biggest, baddest dude in the room. And, you know, working with comedy and that particular, like, stay with me, stay with me, stay with me, it's coming approach that you do, that must be a great tool to lower barriers, to allow for that vulnerability, because you have an ability to draw somebody in with a story that you got to use in client sessions, right?
You mean my experience as a writer and my journey itself?
The misdirect that you do, that you take two guys try to find their car, right? And you let them run for over 2 minutes. Like, what a simple concept, right?
Well, you know, that's interesting, because I think that, you know, being a therapist there's a lot of art to it. You certainly learn a lot of the science and the clinical aspect of it, but there's a lot of art to it, and that you can approach it in however way you want. And I find that I find myself sometimes really getting curious about one thing in a story and stopping, saying, let's talk about it. What do you mean by that? Well, that's interesting. Well, what do you mean by that? I mean, is it like this or that? And I find myself, in fact, I often have clients who say, I'm so sorry, I'm going off on a tangent. And I will say, well, don't apologize. We're sort of here to go off on the tangents. I mean, the tangents are where it gets interesting. And in fact, the tangent can be the entire point of you being here if we let it happen like that.
Yeah, because that's that looking for the keys metaphor you used, right?
Mm-hmm.
Somebody can spend all this time focusing on the very, okay, according to psychodynamics, this is what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be the mom, it's supposed, whatever. But the keys are actually over there in another alley with something not connected to the original problem. And I agree, those tangents are often so key. And that speaks to that balance of power in the therapist client relationship, that idea that no matter what they do, someone like you, they feel judged, right? And that makes it hard to let down barriers. And I can just see starting with a story changes that, right? The fact that they feel like they have to apologize for a tangent when it's their time.
Right.
That tells me so much about some of the inherent issues with the system that it sounds like you're overcoming with your methods. Now,
in fact, I love that. In fact, I'm writing down tangents right now because I don't know if I have a chapter about tangents and how tangents are actually the main road.
I had that twice this week with clients that they apologized for a tangent. I was sitting here going, like, this is a moment. Right? Like, this is something I didn't know. This is totally brand new. And one client, I'm like, oh my God, I have been an idiot. Now it makes sense. It was that one little piece. And it was over Guardians of the Galaxy 3, right? A response to a thing involving a dude with, like, the skin of his face stretched, a CGI raccoon. And it was so profound. And I'm like, this is the stuff. Phil, hang on, we got to pay the bills. We got to go to our sponsors. Hang on. Phil Stark, therapist and comedy screenwriter, talking metaphors and mental health. Be right back. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back on It's Not Therapy. I'm still Liana Kersner. I'm still not a therapist. I'm still talking to Phil Stark, author of Dude, Where's My Catharsis? He also wrote the script for Dude, Where's My Car? Episodes of South Park and That 70s Show. And he's a therapist in California. So before the break, Phil, we were talking about tangents and meaning and good stuff, right? Like, this is what we all get up in the morning for, stories. Right, going back as far as human history, going after Norse myth, the ancient Greek stories. They are stories of trauma and depression and anxiety. I've heard rabbinical scholars talk about Lot's wife turning into the pillar of salt as a PTSD metaphor. And this is something I think we've detached from clinical practice because we made it clinical. We had to make it scientific, right? We had to make it boring to be taken seriously.
Yeah. Well, once you start dealing with insurance companies, things need to be quantified and measured and defined. Not to take anything away from insurance companies, but they work in a particular way.
Medically necessary.
Right. Yeah. Now, I feel like a lot of people who have never been in therapy think that seeing a therapist is having somebody ask you, how do you feel about that? How do you feel about that? Oh, how do you feel about that? Which can be a little bit antagonistic and maybe put a little people on the defensive. But what I'm trying to do in my book is give people examples of things that come up in session and ways to understand things they might be going through in a way that they might finish a chapter and be like, oh, that sort of was me. And, oh, is that what therapy is like?
Have you found that metaphors overcome some people being taught a limited emotional vocabulary? Because we know that's an issue with certain populations, right? That they just aren't taught as many words for different things, or they're taught to ignore or deny certain states. And so they're feeling it and they don't know they're feeling it because they don't have a word for it.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of normalization. There's a lot of support. If there's a couple that's having a lot of conflict and the woman is blaming the guy for being misogynistic, then the guy's like, well, I'm a misogynist. I guess I hate women. But, we might get into that and talk about his family history and talk about the women in his life and talk about how the treatment of women was modeled for him. And we learned that he's not a misogynist. He's simply acting in the way that he was programmed to do. In fact, there's a chapter all about how our sort of personal approaches to these relationships are like records that are imprinted as we grow up very early ages. And it's very hard for us to not break out of those grooves to act the way we would like to. And a lot of the work in therapy is understanding that, learning that we don't have to listen to this particular song and putting the work in to bump that record player and have the record skip and listen to a different song and be able to act in a different way. So we're not defining ourselves as one surface level definition. We're getting into our individual personal history, learning why we act the way we do and why we're programmed to act like that. And then learning that it's much more than a label. There's a lot more to it.
Yeah, those labels can be really, they can be a mind trap, right? When we get into Mind Palace, that's just boom, close the door, because people get defined by, especially some of the Axis 2 stuff. We don't call it that anymore, but I don't like saying personality disorder, right?
Yeah, sure.
I know some absolutely lovely people with borderline personality disorder, right? And so it's much easier if somebody has a dissociative condition to talk about Bruce Banner and the Incredible Hulk, which bless those guys back in the day, the number of traumatic backstories on superheroes. It's such a godsend, right? Pointing out that Tony Stark is a guy with a disability. He has basically a radioactive pacemaker, right? That he has to be careful with. Batman, early childhood trauma. Superman, the immigrant experience. Right? And this is not an accident. These were guys talking about their own lives. And they, back then, for some reason, thought their stories were important enough to make fantastic, to make these things superpowers instead of being weak or broken. And even that perspective can be huge for someone. Because, I mean, the challenge is you're coming... Even the whole idea of needing help, even the whole idea for a therapist of helping somebody, I feel is a little bit, you got to be careful with it, right? Because helping suggests need suggests power suggests, well, that you can be, it can be really easy to edge somebody into something that might not be right for them because they're trying to please you because you're the authority figure.
Yeah, it also implies that you can be fixed, which implies you might be broken. But the superpower thing is interesting because I often have clients who, for instance, I might work with a producer who is super organized, attentive to everybody on the set. Their superpower is they're great producers. They anticipate needs, they empathize, they're selfless, they sacrifice, right? And that's made them successful in their careers. But in a relationship, that's like their super weakness because they're not able to define their needs. They're not able to let other people take care of themselves. And so it's interesting. Sometimes I will work with clients who's like, you have this amazing superpower in this field of your life. But at the same time, that same superpower seems to be making difficulties in this phase of your life. So it's about understanding that. And I really like that superpower.
Yeah, which is far easier for somebody to understand than Jungian shadow work. It's the exact same thing, right? But you don't have to explain kryptonite. You do have to explain the shadow of every trait. And not only does it save a lot of time, but I do find it creates a comfort because somebody's, I think, a lot more cool with being compared to a character who's current and popular now, as opposed to, you look up Jung and there's some scary stuff about
but it's much better to say, oh, you're sort of like Rocky Raccoon and Guardians, as opposed to, you remind me of Sisyphus.
Right. Well, it's that it's the Star Trek thing, right? Do you watch Star Trek? See, this is where metaphors can fail.
Sure.
Okay, the Darmok episode.
Okay, hold on, you lost me. I watched Star Trek, but I'm lost on the Darmok episode.
Okay, both Wrath of Khan and this Star Trek: The Next Generation episode rely heavily on metaphors. There's a bookshelf in Khan's room right at the beginning of Wrath of Khan, where Moby Dick is there and Paradise Lost is there, and it's basically a Rosetta Stone for the entire movie. And a lot of people miss it. They're like, oh my God, this is Star Trek doing the greats. But then on Next Generation, Captain Picard, Patrick Stewart, lands on a planet who only speaks in metaphors. So the universal translator can translate the words, but not the meaning behind the words. And he ends up connecting to this guy because a myth is very much like the Gilgamesh myth. And so they can speak in a common metaphor but they have to get there by recognizing the similarities. I think we take some of those common metaphors for granted, right? That people, because if I say Darmok and you don't know what it means, it's totally lost. But most people know who Superman is. Most people know who Batman is. And I find, and I'd like to know your experiences about this, when someone has a very negative reaction to a metaphor, Superman's a big one for people. Oh, he's a Boy Scout. Oh, I don't buy the whole hope thing. It's cliche. It's that can tell you a lot too.
Yeah.
Right. It can say, okay, because to me, that's unmet need. Somebody can't buy into Superman. That tells me that those people that were supposed to protect them didn't at some point. And that's where, when you get into your approach, the very light, I'll say again, very vulnerable comedy that you do, you're prepared for people to not get it. That's gotta be so powerful in overcoming those barriers. You're modeling vulnerability so people feel safer doing it too. Is that intentional, or did I just completely psychoanalyze you?
No, I hear you. In fact, I think the point that I'm hearing from you is that you're not going to talk to someone about Superman if they don't like comic books.
That's right.
I've worked, for instance, part of the pleasure I take in this work is working with people in the way that they need to feel seen and understood. If I might be working with somebody who is very analytical and is a coder and works with computers, and we'll be talking about how code, and we'll talk about, like, instead of the metaphor about how we're all sort of defined by the record player and the song that is imprinted on us and it plays the rest of our life, I might say, this code was written for you to act in the way of this relationship a long time ago, and it seems like it's a little out of date, and it's buggy, and it's hard to go back and rewrite that code. Nobody wants to do that, so you keep patching it up. But sometimes it's worth going back and really getting deep, digging into it. And so with that particular client, that might work better. So whether it's Superman, coding, or anything, there's always a metaphor that a client can help better understand a basic concept.
Now, this was a question I was not going to ask, but it might be a good way to lead on based on what you just said. There's a tendency we have nowadays to say certain things are good for you or bad for you, right? There's high art, must-see TV. Succession means you're smart, but I don't know, some just silly, goofy show. I'm trying to think, because I think everything I love is wonderful. But something like Cuphead on Netflix. I freaking love that show. But some people are like, oh, it's a cartoon. There's a hierarchy of media. And I work in video games a lot. I'm a game designer as well. And a lot of people go, oh, video games, parents especially are not understanding what their kids are into, and their kids are trying to communicate with them, and their parents are missing it. And every time I read an article on, oh, my kid fell down the Andrew Tate rabbit hole, right? I see, well, they were dropping top G metaphors in your presence all along the line, and you missed it. Do you think that this culture, I'm going to drop it, culture war, where some things are good for you, some things are bad for you, are actually a disservice to people who are taking comfort in stuff where we can see all the bad in it instead of understanding why it means something to them?
Well, that's interesting. When you mentioned that, I think immediately of being a parent, and I have 2 teenagers, and it's very easy for me to see something they're doing or watching or enjoying and judge it through my prism. Oh, what are you doing? Read a book. Read this book. Don't do that. Now, of course, being a parent, there's safety precautions. You want to make sure your kid's safe, but I really try hard to understand that my kids need to have their own experiences, and even if I don't understand why, they'd rather not sit with me on the couch and watch Game of Thrones, and instead stream a Taylor Swift concert live on Twitter. It's a totally different experience for them, and I try to really understand that and give them the space to experience that. And I feel like when I try to limit them and tell them what I think they should do and what is appropriate, invariably they rebel against that and do the exact opposite. So I feel like people might be drawn to some of the darker parts of what we might call these culture wars, maybe because they feel like they're not understood or given the space to figure out who they want to be. And the easiest way to predict what a teen's going to do is by the parent telling them what they can't do. In fact, that was one of my favorite jokes from the pilot of that 70s show, when Eric and Donna and the gang decide to take the car out of town to go see a Todd Rundgren show, is when Red tells Eric specifically, "Oh, by the way, don't take the car out of town." And they say, okay. He comes back and he sits down with Kitty. She says, "What are the kids doing tonight?" He says, "Going out of town." "How do you know?" "I told them not to." And that's exactly what they did.
And there, we land on a metaphor. So that's a good place to wrap. I can't land the plane better than that. Metaphor again. Phil Stark, thanks so much. Dude, Where's My Catharsis is the name of the book.
Mm-hmm.
And that's out now?
Yeah, it's available on Amazon. It's a digital download, or you can buy it print on demand. It's a friendly and engaging guide to talk therapy, 50 chapters of similar metaphors like the ones we've just talked about. Amazing.
And your website is Stark Talk?
Starktalk.net. You can Google me, Phil Stark. I'm associate marriage and family therapist in California, and I see clients exclusively via telehealth, so I can see anybody in the entire state of California.
That's amazing. So Stark like Iron Man, guys. Tony Stark. Phil Stark.
It could be, depending on the metaphor you respond to, it could be Tony Stark or House of Stark.
Or House of Stark, yes. Right. Or Stark Naked. That's probably how a lot of people listening are going to remember that.
A lot of my college buddies remember me in that way.
All right, everybody. We'll be back after this break talking more about metaphors and mental health on It's Not Therapy. Stay tuned. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back on It's Not Therapy, the final moments of It's Not Therapy. I'm still Liana Kersner. I'm still not a therapist, and we're still talking metaphors and mental health. How we talk about our mental health. And wasn't Phil great? I thought Phil was just great. Check out his columns. They're so unique. I enjoy them as stories. Now, I talked off the top about how my brain likes to look for patterns. And that's something I have to keep in mind, because not only do I sometimes read in things that aren't there, so I can't assume that pattern is a guarantee, but other times I notice a pattern and I confirm that, yes, the pattern exists. I'm not just seeing faces in the bark of trees. But I don't know what it means. And I think it's really important to say, I don't know what this means, but it's a thing, so let's discuss it. So if you have any comments about what I'm about to say, if you want to tell me what I'm about to talk about means to you, I am curious. You can go to nottherapyshow.com, fill out the contact form, join our mailing list at nottherapyshow.com. We're going to announce a new workshop in a couple of weeks, so join the mailing list, or Liana at Not Therapy Show to email me directly, or Twitter, Instagram at Not Therapy. Now, this is the pattern I've observed. Okay, this was the point where I kind of clued in that we got to be really careful with our language when it comes to mental health. Because I say I feel depressed or I feel anxious, or those are feelings. I notice other people refer to their mental health struggles. To me, it comes across as a possession or a part of who they are. They say my anxiety or my depression. And that, perhaps it's a way of validating the state, but that is so different from the way I come at it, because I want those states to be as far away from the core of who I am as possible. They are fleeting, they are temporary, they are not me. So what does it mean when someone makes what they have been taught to believe is a mood disorder a part of their identity? My anxiety, my depression. It could mean a bunch of things. But it's curious wording, isn't it? And it could just be, it's their way of getting comfortable with it. This is a part of me. But is it? Is this thing people have said is a problem, a disorder, a part of you? Or is it a reaction to things? Again, a central premise of the show, of the work I do, is top 10 phrase. Healthy goals are based on things you can control. And people aren't designed to walk around with an unbearable level of anxiety. We're not designed to walk around feeling mostly or constantly depressed. These should not be our baselines, right? But so many people just get so used to feeling that way. Is it a companion? Is it something people are verbally trying to get comfortable with? I don't know. And that's why I personally like using sci-fi and superhero metaphors to talk about what's going on with me. These things are fun for me instead of talking about sad stuff. You know, I'd rather talk about the dark side of the force than anxiety or depression. And I'm aware it's the same thing, but it's a more fun spin on the same thing. And that's, top 10 phrase, me not letting problems that aren't my fault lead to mistakes that are. I can't help feeling down sometimes. I can't help feeling exhausted. I mean, I just want to burn the world because I've been sick for so long. But creating a metaphor for the experience gives me both a sense of distance and a sense of control over the issue. And that's why I'm curious about people to refer to it as my anxiety or my depression. I wonder what that does for people, because it wouldn't do anything positive for me. Now, again, I'm not saying don't do it. This isn't advice. I want to know why. Because it's so common. And again, rare personality type. I don't come at things the same way other people do. And that's why I think I've always been drawn to aliens, the other, that metaphor for something misunderstood. That validated me in the way that other people's metaphors validate them. And the thing that's very important to realize about metaphors is there are no right or wrong answers, no matter what your creative writing teacher taught you. If it helps you, go for it. If it doesn't help you, you have the power to change it. And I do not have the power to extend time. So that's the show. Until next week, remember, your crazy is only a problem if it's hurting you. We'll talk then.